One of the most requested videos I get is to talk about the death of the Sega Dreamcast and how it could have potentially been saved. Sort of like what I did with the Sega Saturn. Well, the thing is, with the Dreamcast was sort of the culmination of all the mistakes that Sega had made from pretty much the second or third year after the launch of the Sega Genesis or Mega Drive. What does that mean? Well, it means that, in my opinion, and you can disagree with it, but in my opinion, I truly believe the Sega Dreamcast was just destined for failure. There was no real way Sega could turn things around by the time the Dreamcast was released. So, to give just a clearer picture on this, we need to go back to, well, the very beginning. You have to understand that Sega never really had one platform that was successful all over the world. For example, the Genesis or Mega Drive was successful in North America and Europe, but it failed to capture the Japanese market. Most people don't even know this, but over in Japan, the Genesis actually came in third place behind both the extremely popular Famicom and NEC's PC Engine. Keep in mind that the Mega Drive or Genesis was released in 1988 over in Japan before coming out in the rest of the world in 1989. What this means is that Sega's market was really split all over the place. You had the Genesis that was successful in North America and in Europe. You had the Master System, or the Mark III, that was extremely successful in Brazil, of all places. And then you also have to remember that they were supporting the Game Gear. And this is all before they decided to release the add-ons like the Sega CD or the 32X. And then finally, when they made the plunge to the Sega Saturn, which you can watch that video I did, which goes into far more detail about why that system collapsed, and it was primarily to do with the build-up from the Sega CD and the 32X, and a lot of poor management decisions on Sega's part. But the idea is, if you look at all these different platforms that Sega was supporting simultaneously, I might add, you really get, an understanding of why the company really decided, okay, from here on out, we need one platform. We're bleeding money. We've stretched ourselves too thin, and we're going to put basically all our cards in this one platform, the Dreamcast. Unfortunately for them, though, only a few markets were really ready for the Dreamcast. North American market really was because, well, the Saturn completely tanked here, and so was Europe. However, in Japan, the Saturn was an extremely popular system. Had it been allowed to live its full console life of 5 or 6 years, there's a very good chance that the Dreamcast would have just, been equally as successful. But again, because they were stretched so thin, that wasn't really an option that the company had. They really needed one platform to sort of rule them all, as it were. But unfortunately, that was just the beginning of their problems. It's pretty amazing what Sega was able to do both in North America and in Europe in terms of sort of swaying public opinion back in their favor, because of all the damage that Sega had done with the Sega CD, the 32X add-on, and the Sega Saturn. Most people thought, well, the Dreamcast was doomed, like just conceptual stage, it was already over. But they did a really good job. They had a really successful launch in North America and in Europe. However, in Japan, the system just totally tanked. It never really got off the ground in Japan because, let's be honest, there was almost no games available at the Japanese launch of the Dreamcast in 1998. And by the time the system was released here in North America and in Europe, at least there were some really, really good titles. Unfortunately, after the launch, things slowed down tremendously. And not only that, there was the impending release of the PlayStation 2 that would ultimately just put the nail in the coffin. So to recap, we've got a company that is basically, their management is all over the place. They've now consolidated all of their individual markets under one hopeful product, the Dreamcast, and that really caused turmoil on a global scale because, number one, they were already stretched too thin, they were losing money. Number two, they just sort of ticked off certain markets that really enjoyed one particular platform or another, and now you're saying, well, here you go, you're only going to have one particular platform. And then, of course, the biggest one of all was the fact that the PlayStation 2 was right around the corner. And since Sony was one of the companies that, they were making DVD drives and things like that, to them, they could put a DVD drive in the PlayStation 2 at a really affordable price, which is something that Sega could never hope to do with the Dreamcast. If they wanted to put a DVD drive in the Dreamcast, it would have cost an exceedingly large amount of money. And obviously that would have been put back on the gamer. And considering, this market that that Sega was going in, I don't know if that really would have changed anything. I know years back that's what everyone said. Oh, well, it was the DVD player that ultimately did them in. But more so, I think it was just a culmination of all the mistakes they had made after the launch of the Sega Genesis, and it all combined to form this perfect, basically, strategy against the company. There was really nothing they could do. When Sony launched the PlayStation 2, they had a strong marketing campaign, but to be really honest, they didn't even need it. They had the market all wrapped up from the minute they announced the PlayStation 2, particularly when they announced that it was going to include a DVD player inside the system. That was it. When that machine launched, if you were around at that particular point in time, you know that there were many people who bought the PlayStation 2 solely for the reason that it played DVDs. They didn't even care that it was a game player, and that was ultimately the big shift in the gaming industry when we went from gaming-centric platforms to like systems that did a lot of other things and also played video games. And so that's pretty much what doomed the system. There were a lot of other little things here and there, but the crux of it is the fact that Sega had made so many mistakes. There were just so many developers that were ticked off. Like EA didn't even develop games for the Dreamcast. Blockbuster at launch didn't even rent games for the Dreamcast. Like, it was just the faith in the platform was gone because of what had happened before. Because Sega had tried to extend the life of the Genesis with the Sega CD and with the 32X, and the fact that the 32X was released mere months before the Sega Saturn. These were huge, colossal mistakes. The Sega Saturn's rushed launch, the fact that they surprised developers by saying, oh, by the way, it's launching now, and developers weren't ready. They pretty much pissed off the entire market, both their loyal consumers and everyone in the gaming industry. And yes, they were able to, pick up some steam with the Dreamcast, but ultimately, how long was that going to last? They were bleeding money. They had no choice, and it's really sad, but on the very last day of January, back in 2001, they announced that they were essentially leaving the hardware business, and I know it really was a sad day for hardcore Sega fans, but at the same time, it really didn't surprise anyone. And looking back on it now, the only way to save the Sega Dreamcast would have been to not make the mistakes they made. And that means we would have had to have gone all the way back in time to the Genesis days, and ironically, their biggest success would ultimately be their undoing.
Solve numerous intricate puzzles and win heroic battles with ferocious monsters.
Do